The night
This
the corner
residue here,
office went dark.
it's recent.
Like,
From the entry log,
subscribe
let me check.
and drop a
No,
comment
it's not
if you think
logged.
power
The breach is
protects you.
confirmed. We need options
Because
now.
tonight's
Shutting down the
story
ports is
proves
our
it
best
doesn't.
bet.
Do it.
The
Monitor
call
for back
came in
doors.
just after midnight, cutting to the low hum of downtown traffic, like a scream through glass.
Look at this spike.
The
It's
CEO had been
anomalous.
found
I see
dead
it,
inside his
cross-referencing the
private
logs now.
office,
It's escalating.
high
Isolate the
above the
source.
city
On it.
streets, in a tower built to symbolize permanence and control. The building still glowed against the night sky, but inside, the lights were harsh, clinical, and unforgiving. Whatever illusion of safety money had bought into the moment that office door was forced open. The scene was wrong in a way investigators couldn't immediately name. No signs of forced entry. No scattered papers. No panic frozen into the room. The body lay where it fell, as if the victim had been interrupted mid-thought. A half-finished glass of water sat on the desk. The security system had been disabled with surgical precision. This wasn't chaos. It was intention. Within minutes, the city's elite homicide unit flooded the floor. Detectives moved carefully, speaking in low voices, already aware this case would not stay quiet for long. The victim wasn't just wealthy. He was visible, influential, the kind of man whose decisions shaped thousands of lives he would never meet, and someone had decided he didn't get to make any more of them. As word spread through law enforcement channels, a single name began surfacing, one that didn't yet belong to a suspect, but to a question: Luigi Mangione. At first, he was just a footnote, a former consultant, a man whose professional relationship with the victim had ended badly years earlier. There was no active warrant, no immediate cause to pull him in, but there was something else, an online trail that refused to stay buried. Detective Mara Ellison found it first. Ellison had spent years chasing financial crimes that bled into violence, and she trusted patterns more than instincts. When she reviewed the victim's digital footprint, one anomaly stood out: a series of encrypted emails flagged by the company's internal firewall weeks before the murder. They weren't threats. They were ideas. Long, structured arguments about power, responsibility, and what Mangione called corporate immunity from consequence. At the bottom of one draft, never sent, was a line that made her pause. When accountability is impossible, correction becomes inevitable. It wasn't enough to act on, but it was enough to keep digging. Mangione, it turned out, had changed in the years after leaving the company. Former colleagues described him as brilliant, but increasingly withdrawn. He had withdrawn from industry events, stopped networking, stopped caring about reputation. Instead, he wrote essays, long-form posts buried on obscure forums. They weren't rants. They were manifestos. He wrote about systems that crushed people quietly, about executives who made decisions that ruined lives but never touched the wreckage themselves, about how violence wasn't always loud. Sometimes it wore a suit and signed paperwork. Still, none of that made him a killer. Then the financial unit found something else. In the 6 months leading up to the murder, Mangione had liquidated nearly everything he owned. No luxury purchases. No attempts to disappear, just a systematic shedding of assets, as if he were preparing for a future that didn't include them. At the same time, he'd withdrawn from personal relationships. Friends reported unanswered messages. Family said he'd become focused, calm, and disturbingly resolved. The press, unaware of Mangione's existence, speculated wildly: a disgruntled employee, a corporate rival, organized crime. The company's stock dipped, then rebounded. Life, as always, moved on. But inside the task force, tension thickened. The security footage from the building told its own quiet story. A figure entering through a staff access corridor. No face visible. No hesitation. Someone who knew exactly where to go and how long they had. This wasn't opportunistic. It was rehearsed. Ellison requested a warrant to search Mangione's residence. What they found wasn't what anyone expected. There were no weapons, no trophies, no frantic evidence of guilt. Instead, there were notebooks, dozens of them, neatly organized, labeled by theme, not date: economics, ethics, power, collapse, and at the center of it all, a single document saved on an offline device. The file name was simple: Manifesto_final. As analysts began reading, the room went silent. This wasn't a confession. It was a framework, a philosophical justification, laid out with terrifying clarity. Mangione didn't describe an act. He described a necessity. He wrote about a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed, about how symbols of power only fall when someone proves they can. Near the end of the document was a passage that sent a chill through every investigator present. This is not the end. This is the proof. The document wasn't dated. And Luigi Mangione was nowhere to be found. As task force members realized the implications, a single, terrifying possibility took shape. What if the murder wasn't the conclusion of Mangione's thinking, but the opening argument? Because if the manifesto was right, then the night the coroner office went dark might only have been the beginning. The argument spreads. By sunrise, the city had learned just enough to be afraid. News outlets reported the murder with careful restraint, avoiding names while emphasizing the word targeted. The victim's company released a statement about cooperation and grief. Markets trembled, then steadied. But inside the task force, the atmosphere curdled into urgency. What investigators had pulled from Luigi Mangione's apartment wasn't just motive, it was momentum. The manifesto didn't read like anger. It read like inevitability. Analysts broke it down line by line, tracing citations and references that revealed a disciplined mind. Mangione quoted economists, legal scholars, even internal corporate language lifted from annual reports. He argued that systems shielded decision-makers from consequences, creating a vacuum where accountability should be. And then, with chilling calm, he proposed a solution: disruption through symbolism, not chaos. Precision. Detective Mara Ellison understood the danger immediately. This wasn't a man lashing out. It was a man trying to convince others. As the document circulated within secure channels, a parallel conversation ignited online. Anonymous accounts began sharing fragments, sentences lifted verbatim from Mangione's writing. They appeared on obscure message boards first, then migrated to larger platforms under layers of irony and commentary. Some users criticized the ideas. Others debated them. A few defended them with unsettling enthusiasm. The manifesto was escaping containment. Cyber units traced the leaks to scheduled posts set up weeks earlier. Mangione had planned for discovery. He had anticipated the raid, the search, the shock. The document was designed to be found, and once found, to spread, not as propaganda, but as provocation. Meanwhile, the hunt for Mangione intensified. License plate readers flagged a vehicle registered in his name-crossing state lines the night of the murder. Credit cards remained untouched. Cell phone signals vanished into dead zones. He was moving carefully, avoiding patterns, shedding digital skin with each mile. To Ellison, it felt less like a fugitive fleeing and more like a strategist repositioning. Then came the second shock. A regional hospital reported break-in, not for drugs or equipment, but for records. Specifically, archive reports tied to a series of industrial layoffs years earlier. Layoffs approved by a board chaired by the same murdered CEO. The theft wasn't violent, but it was deliberate. The files vanished without triggering alarms, as if the intruder knew the system intimately. Ellison stared at the list of companies involved and felt the shape of something forming. The manifesto's arguments weren't abstract. They were anchored to specific decisions, specific meetings, specific signatures. Mangione wasn't just condemning a system. He was building a case against individuals who embodied it. Protective details were quietly assigned to several executives whose names appeared repeatedly in the recovered notes. The move was discreet, but word travels fast in circles of power. Boardrooms filled with hushed conversations. Schedules changed. Public appearances were canceled. For the first time, people accustomed to controlling outcomes felt exposed. Pressure mounted from above. Officials wanted assurances, reassurances, an end, but the investigation refused to cooperate. Forensic teams found traces of Mangione's presence in places that didn't make sense at first. Libraries, archives, municipal buildings. He wasn't hiding. He was researching, pulling threads, mapping histories. Each location tied back to a decision that had rippled outward into lost jobs, shuttered towns, and quiet desperation. The case crossed from homicide into something more volatile. A turning point came when an encrypted message surfaced on a private channel used by policy analysts. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a confession. It was a question posed with unnerving politeness. If the law cannot correct harm after it occurs, who should? The message vanished within minutes, but not before being captured. Metadata pointed to a public terminal in a city hundreds of miles away from the last confirmed sighting. Mangione was moving faster than expected, or he had help. Ellison convened the team and said the words no one wanted to hear. "This isn't about catching him before he runs," she said. "It's about stopping what he's trying to start." As if on cue, a second document appeared online. Shorter than the manifesto, sharper. It reframed the murder not as an act, but as evidence, proof that power could be touched. That insulation was an illusion. The comments beneath it exploded. Arguments, denunciations, uneasy agreement. The discourse itself became the damage. Then the tip came in. A security guard at a closed manufacturing plant reported a man matching Mangione's description entering the property after dark. The plant had been shut down following a merger years earlier, its closure approved by a familiar list of executives. Inside, investigators found fresh footprints and a makeshift workstation. Notes pinned to a wall. Names circled in red. One of those names belonged to a CEO scheduled to speak at a public forum in 48 hours. Ellison felt the clock slam into place. They weren't chasing a man anymore. They were racing an idea that had learned how to move. And as the task force prepared to lock down the event, one final discovery landed like a punch to the chest. A time-stamped draft message, cued to publish automatically. The subject line read simply, "After the argument is heard." The countdown had already begun. The last footnote, the venue was sealed before dawn. Uniformed officers blended with private security. Plainclothes detectives scanned faces, and federal agents monitored every entrance, exit, and shadow corner. The forum was meant to be a controlled space, an exchange of ideas between industry leaders and policymakers, but now it felt like a pressure chamber. Every badge, every radio whisper carried the same unspoken fear. If Mangione was right about anything, it was that symbols matter most when they're public. Detective Mara Ellison stood behind the control desk, eyes fixed on a grid of live feeds. The CEO scheduled to speak had arrived early, surrounded by a cocoon protection that could not disguise the tension in his posture. He smiled for staff. He nodded at cameras. But his eyes kept drifting to exits, to ceilings, to the empty spaces where certainty used to live. Ellison's phone buzzed. The queued message had shifted. The timestamp advanced. Mangione was close. Digital analysts worked frantically, tracing the signal that triggered the update. It wasn't coming from inside the venue. It wasn't coming from the city. It was bouncing. Libraries, transit hubs, public terminals, designed to fragment the trail. He wasn't hiding. He was dispersing. Then a pattern emerged. The signal wasn't random. It was orbiting the forum like a slow, tightening ring. Ellison felt it then, the realization that this wasn't about another act. It was about control of the narrative. Mangione didn't need to be in the room to dominate it. He needed attention, timing, and the certainty that everyone was watching. Security reported a disturbance near the service entrance. A false alarm. It turned out an abandoned bag, nothing inside but folded papers printed with excerpts from the manifesto. Not threats, arguments. Carefully selected passages designed to provoke debate, not panic. And debate erupted instantly. Phones lit up. Screens filled. Commentators argued over whether the papers were proof of danger or proof of grievance. The forum delayed its start. The delay became news. The news became amplification. Ellison's gaze snapped back to the analysts. "Where is he?" she asked. They didn't answer immediately. Then one of them looked up, pale. "He's not coming," the analyst said. "He already did." The queued message went live. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an instruction. It was a conclusion. Mangione wrote that the act had served its purpose, not as an endpoint, but as a demonstration. He argued that once people understood systems could be disrupted, the systems would begin correcting themselves. He named no future targets. He issued no threats. He closed with a single assertion. Fear changes behavior faster than reform ever has. And then, at the bottom, a line Ellison hadn't seen before. I won't be present when this ends. That's the point. The crowd outside the venue swelled as coverage exploded. Inside, the CEO took the stage anyway, voice measured, speech rewritten on the fly. He spoke of responsibility, of reform, of listening. Applause followed, hesitant, uncertain, real. Ellison watched, torn between relief and dread. If Mangione had wanted another act, this was the moment. But there was nothing. No breach. No escalation. Just the echo of an idea settling into the world. Hours later, a lead surfaced from hundreds of miles away. A quiet coastal town. A rented room paid in cash. A laptop left behind, wiped clean except for one final file. Not a manifesto, but a log. Dates, locations, libraries, archives. Every place Mangione had visited, every decision he had traced. The log ended days earlier. No body, no goodbye. Searches expanded, then narrowed, then stalled. Sightings fizzled into rumor. Over time, urgency gave way to uncertainty. The case shifted categories, from active hunt to unresolved disappearance, the kind that leaves investigators with more questions than answers. Public opinion fractured. Some condemned Mangione as a murderer who dressed violence in philosophy. Others debated the systems he criticized, careful to separate argument from act. Companies announced internal reviews. Boards commissioned audits. Quiet changes began to ripple. Not because of a law passed or a policy mandated, but because fear had cracked a veneer of immunity. Ellison testified before committees, careful with words, precise with facts. She refused to speculate on Mangione's fate. When asked if she believed he would strike again, she answered honestly. I believe he wanted to be heard, she said, and he succeeded. Years later, the manifesto would still circulate in fragments, quoted, misquoted, argued over. The murder would remain the hinge point, the moment everything turned. The case would be taught in academies, debated in ethics classes, and cited in security briefings as an example of how modern threats don't always announce themselves with noise. Sometimes they arrive as ideas, sharp enough to cut through certainty. On her desk, Ellison kept a single page from the file. Not the manifesto, not the message. A note found in the rented room, handwritten and signed. If nothing changes, this will happen again. Not by me, by someone who learned. She never forgot it. And if the story unsettled you, if it made you question where power ends and accountability begins, then stay close. Because the next story won't ask for your attention. It will assume it's already been taken.